You're listening to All In. This is the podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jeff Roper. Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of All In. So glad to have you joining us today, and today I've got a special treat for you. I'm going to take you all the way to Anchorage, Alaska. Yes, the frozen northern parts of this great country of the United States of America. And we're going to be interviewing two dear friends of mine, Rod and Teresa Koop. Rod and Teresa are missionaries serving with Foursquare Missions International in Alaska through their ministry called North of Hope. And the reason I'm having them on the podcast, one, is I love these guys a lot. Debbie and I talk about them probably every week or two. Rod and Teresa, your guys' names come up in our household or our conversations. In a good way, not in a bad way. And Debbie always says, "Oh, I love those guys and what they're doing." So we love you guys, and we're glad to have you on the show. And the other reason is I love the missiology of what you are doing there in Alaska. And I think there's a lot that I can learn from it and that our listeners can learn from it. So guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's good to be here, man.
Hey, how would you describe, in a nutshell, what it is that you guys are doing in Alaska?
Wow. Well, I would say that we are just on a daily basis stepping out in faith, believing that our entire journey with the Lord in our lives has prepared us, because He's a genius at preparing people. But that journey has prepared us to engage the opportunities that He provides us. Mm-hmm. And so what we don't really approach our mission field with is a sense that there are a bunch of missing things and that we are sent by God to provide what's missing. Mm-hmm. Instead, what we view is that God, who loves these people and has been working with them, has never abandoned them, has never turned away from them. He loves them so much that He is bringing us into their lives, and He's just opening our eyes to be able to see the things that He has been doing. And then he reminds us of the things that He's worked in us, through the difficulty in our lives, through the tragedy that we've gone through the times that we've needed Him the most, and He shows up and redeems us. He shows us how that life experience and His work in us is a perfect match to speak encouragement and life into the situation or the people that we come into contact with here. And from that, a friendship will develop, and an opening will be created of how we can practically serve what God is doing. And then we just press into that with simple faith.
Now, would you say that your primary ministry is to the native peoples of Alaska?
Well, Native Alaskans for sure, not necessarily primarily Alaskan natives. Okay. I'm a Native Alaskan. This is what we look like as well.
Yeah, right, I know.
Yeah. So, when I think of who it is that we're serving, my primary assignment in town here, when I am in town, is to our Anchorage Police Department and to law enforcement. And so when I looked around the room at one of my training events a couple of weeks ago in Fairbanks, I was with U.S. Marshals and Alaska State Troopers and law enforcement and Department of Safety people, and we were all being trained by 3 people out of Oklahoma, and so to address things that happen in law enforcement in our state and in our departments, and how we can help diffuse and intervene when there are tragedies and things that happen. So in that case, I would say that it was about half and half. Okay. We do have village safety officers who are Native or Alaska Natives, mm-hmm. that we serve and work with. I'm talking, of course, on the critical incident side of chaplaincy and the stuff that I do in that. But on a, let's just say, a regular weekly basis, when I'm called out, it can be either or. And I'm, again, talking about the police side of things.
Yeah,
But
because Tracy, you serve as a chaplain. Is it for the entire police department of Anchorage, or are you? I'm not clear how that works. Is it specific?
yes, yeah, I am the lead chaplain for the department itself. They
Okay.
have an outside agency that also serves the department, but inside the department, I am their lead. I'm also on call for them in any given situation. For example, the last 2 calls I've been out on have been double notifications to family members, that death notifications, where we started at one place and then we had to move to another place to find the family that was not able to be there for the initial notification. And the first one I'm thinking of is a Native family. And it was a severely tragic situation. But then when we tracked down, I gave them my card and we tracked down the dad, they did. And we found him at the Alaska Native Medical Center facilities in the hospital and wound up going in with them into a very private space so the family could share with them, with the dad, what had taken place. And so their response as a Alaska Native family was completely different than the one I did 2 days ago, which was, folks that look just like me. We're white people and we're living in this town. But what I do for them, for the police department, yes, I serve on the street. So my phone rings when there's a suicide or homicide, multiple victims, assault, stuff like that are on the road, things that involve children or sexual assault. My phone can ring. But then my office is also at the department.
Okay,
And
great.
then they can contact me there. But it's like 10 o'clock last night, I got a text from someone saying, I need to see you. Can we make a date for this week? Mm-hmm. And so I will meet with them off-site because it's very important that they have privacy. So I meet them wherever they need to meet me.
Okay. Well, you guys tell me a little bit about your journey. I know the first time that I met you, Rod, was a number of years back in Los Angeles. We somehow or another, I ended up on the third floor of the central office building at Foursquare for some meeting that I didn't know why I was there, that I was invited to, and you were there, and you and Ralph Moore and a few other people, and we got to talking about church planting initiatives around the world. And I think I got invited in just as a missionary who happened to be in town, or burning bush experience or something like that. And I think that was our first conversation. And so you were living in LA at the time. You guys tell us your story, because you're both natives of Alaska. You were raised there. Then I saw you in LA, and now you're back there. Tell us how that all happened. What was the story behind that?
Well, when Teresa graduated from high school, we were already married. We married between her junior and senior year, and so the deal was that if she got a scholarship to go to college, we would leave the state so that could happen, and she did. So we left Alaska, and our intention was to go outside for 4 years and get the college education and come home. But in that 4-year period, the Lord opened up the door for us to enter youth ministry in a Foursquare church. And as youth workers, we were just loving that role. And then a series of circumstances happened. Our pastor was killed in a car accident. The youth pastor became the pastor. And then we were asked to become the youth pastors of the church in quick succession. And so suddenly we were shepherding a group of kids. And we fell in love with them. Having a call in our lives was, obvious in that time, and really we just began to just follow the leading of the Lord, and that led to 15 years of youth ministry. And then
what
we were
city
sent.
Was that?
Well, it was 9 years in Wofford Heights, California. That's up in the mountains out of Bakersfield, and then it was another 6 years with Larry and Sue Spousta in Salem, Oregon.
Oh, okay, great.
And then Larry and Sue sent us to our first pastorate, which was in Stanwood, Washington. And we took a church at that point that was a new church. Randy Remington had been pastoring it, but he had gone to New Life in Everett. And so we took that church, and we were there for 4 years. And in that intervening time, as we were shepherding that church through and into a building project and getting them into their own facilities, Larry and Sue were asked to be the Midwest District supervisors. And so he knew, because of us working together on several church plants that we did out of New Hope in Salem, he knew of our passion for church planting and invited us to come join him in Colorado Springs to become district church planting leaders.
Okay.
Yeah. So that led to Colorado. And Jeff, at the end of that time, it was 2002 when the districts consolidated back into a smaller number, that Teresa and I began preparing to get back to Alaska. We were desperate to get up here. We sold our home. I had a bivocation. We were relocating, and the phone rang, and it was Jack Hayford on the line, who had just become Foursquare's new president in 2004.
Okay.
And him and Jim Scott and Glenn Burris asked if we would consider moving to LA instead of Alaska to oversee church planting nationally. And so that was a shock. That was unexpected and something that we had to pray about. And a couple of days later, we surrendered to go to LA. I mean, we're Alaskans at heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
The invitation to go to LA was not met with wholesale enthusiasm.
Yeah.
So the fact that you met us in LA on the third floor was not something that we orchestrated. It was something we surrendered to. Now, I will say that the wisdom of the Lord in bringing us there and preparing us is unmistakable, and we're remarkably grateful for that season. And it allowed us to be able to rub shoulders with some incredible leaders, and one of which you mentioned with Ralph Moore, and really we were looking at how we planted churches, and the whole missiology behind it, and exploring maybe some fresh ways of looking at the harvest, and ways of just acknowledging that God can get this thing done 1,000 different ways. And so we had to create new pathways in our thinking and be more generous in our missiology so that could happen.
Now, how did you make that transition now from LA back to Anchorage? How did that eventually happen?
Well, you remember when Pastor Jack he decided not to continue on as president, and then Glenn was placed in an interim year. Glenn asked us to work with the districts and to help them strengthen their own missional leadership, so that they would be less dependent on a national person. And that was by design, because Glenn and Tammy were both very open to us going back to Alaska. And so we stayed at the national office another 2 years, so a total of 7 years. But it was a sending process as much as it was a going process.
Okay.
And anyway, and we, during that time, wrote a proposal so that FMI would recognize Alaska as a mission field. And then we would be deployed as missionaries out of the Foursquare Missions Department. And we felt we needed that because we just knew enough about Alaska that if we didn't think and behave and react like missionaries, we would be far less effective, on this mission field.
Okay. Now let's unpack that a little bit, and for our listeners, they may find us getting too much into the weeds here, but I've been wanting to have this conversation with you for a long time, as I've had it with other people. And it's this question: what is it that actually defines something as mission rather than local church? If somebody becomes a missionary, we normally assume they've crossed a national boundary. They've gone from the United States to Russia or to China or something like that. What was the thinking and the understanding in your mind that helped be a catalyst to this domestic mission, that there is something intrinsic in the assignment that makes it mission, not necessarily a geographical or a geopolitical relocation? What was that?
That's a great question. There are cultural boundaries that that when they are not acknowledged and addressed, um, those cultures will never be bridged, and those boundaries are very real.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, the fact that Alaska is a part of the United States is of little consequence to its identity as a mission field.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, and I do remember being told that we're on a slippery slope. That if we declare Alaska mission field, then what's to stop us from declaring, native reservations in the continental United States as mission fields? What's to stop us from declaring, different ethnic pockets in large cities as mission field? And that was something that I said, yes. What is stopping us from doing that? I personally believe that all of those represent cultures that need to be reached out into, that are as foreign to us as going to India or Pakistan or any other country. Mm-hmm. And the other part of it is that we don't have a life-giving, biblically faithful gospel presence within that culture. Mm-hmm. I think that's another piece that needs to be missing. Mm-hmm. And as missionaries, one of the things that we have observed is that not everywhere is appropriate to plant a Foursquare church. Sometimes there is missionaries that have already gone into a community and there is a gospel presence, but they're hanging on by the skin of their teeth. And all they need is somebody to come alongside and to encourage them, serve them, mm-hmm. and cheer them on. And by so doing, strengthen the gospel presence that right. is happening in that area.
Kingdom trumps every time. It's got to be the kingdom thinking all the time.
Absolutely.
I had a conversation about a year ago with a guy that's planting a church in a major U.S. city that is, for all intents and purposes, an unreached city, multiple millions of people that live in it. And he was getting very animated because we were having a very similar conversation. And he just goes, Jeff, I would rather, I identify with you guys as missionaries more than I identify with U.S. pastors. Why can't I be designated an urban missionary serving in the United States? And that was his heartbeat, because he felt like he had gone into this global city to pioneer in a region, in a community that had no viable gospel presence. And there's a missionary mindset that's totally different than a pastoral mindset. And they're not. It's not that one is better than the other. They're just they're for two different contexts.
Well, one, unfortunately, and this is my experience here, one is so clear. And to have a pastoral kind of context is to go in and gather a group of people who will begin to function and move as an already saved team. Generally speaking, this is what people think of when they want to plant a church. And I'm not saying this for everybody, I'm saying what I've experienced. And they start thinking of how to take over, how to go into a neighborhood. Like, we have two of the most diverse neighborhoods that were addressed in the country, and just right across the road here in Anchorage. Our U.S. Census showed us that. But when people who have a traditional church or pastoral mindset come in, they think, how do we get get a building where we can open the doors and get programs going and things that will serve these children and get these parents in here and ultimately pay a salary and the mortgage and all of that. Mm-hmm. Again, nothing wrong with that. And honestly, Jeff, it would be so much easier if we had come to Alaska to do that. People get that. Yeah. They think, okay, let's gather people and pay a salary, or at least bivocationally we can do that, because people love to gather together. But we have been so sent to the lost. Mm-hmm. I don't know how else to describe that. People, I will walk away from a group of people who are already found and love to gather to worship, and they want to do it every week or twice a week, and they want to be together. I will find myself getting restless and wondering, where are the people who have no people?
Yeah.
Where are the people who have no one? one of the first things I ask, like I asked this mama a couple of days ago when I had to bring her the news after going to her husband and letting her know about the death of her son, and then getting to the next place, and they're now together, and I asked the mama this question ultimately, finally, after some of the other information had been passed. I said, do you have a pastor, priest, rabbi, or friend, or people that I can help you reach? Because the next several hours especially are going to be horrible. And so she had a person that they could call and I could help them reach. But so often what I will hear is this: we don't have anybody. I have heard people say, we go to 3 different churches and nobody knows our names. Or no, chaplain, we don't have anybody. So one of the things I will ask is this: may I be your person for this little while? May I be your people and find you some people to be with you until we can get you through this spot. And the difference between having a pastor's mindset for me and being a missionary is that I'm always, always going to them.
Yeah.
Always.
I find that to be the difference maker between as a former pastor like yourselves. I was responding at that point to Jesus' mandate to come out from amongst the world and be separate, be his disciples, follow after him. As a missionary, I'm responding to Jesus' call to go out into all the world, proclaim the good news, and that our true north as missionaries is the field. We're looking at how do we help these people understand their encounter with God? How do we bring the good news of what God has done in Christ to them? And it's a totally different mindset that we have to process through. Not like we've been saying, neither one is right or wrong. It's which one are you called to serve at this juncture of your life.
And I would like to add just a thing about culturally here. There is plenty, and especially in our Native communities, there are plenty of resources that are established and are owned by the Alaska Native corporations, by the organizations that serve specifically the Native peoples. Mm-hmm. And so they don't need Santa Claus to come in here. And I don't mean it, I'm just saying, they don't need another white person to come in and say, oh, look what we can do for you. We can give you a nice building, or we can give you stuff, or whatever. They're so aware of the fact that they don't have that need. But what they need, and this is what they're responding to, is presence.
Yeah.
And us willing to go in. Like, for example, we are working on a project that Rod will probably talk about out on Prince of Wales with the Haida, Tlingit, and Tsimshian tribes. And through the last 5 years, we've been traveling down there and in development for this longhouse project that's happening this season. They just broke ground on it. But there are leaders in those communities, and in Klawock especially. This is where the cultural issue comes in, where they have to send their loved ones into Anchorage to the Alaska Native Medical Center, but they have no people here. They have no family here. And then one in particular, she's here for 12 weeks of treatments for the same type of cancer that I recently am coming through. And so this gal contacts me from Prince of Wales and said, I'm sending you my neighbor. Or she calls me and says, my uncle is in the hospital. And the only reason I can go in there, which is totally different than what I do for the police department. Police department, they call or they dispatch me into the hospital. I can poke my head in, introduce myself, and be right there. The only way I get to come close to the family members and friends and neighbors of the Indian families that are coming up is that I am introduced to them by their friends and their people on the island. It's completely different. And when I enter that room, I say, hi, I've been sent by, and I give the names. Mm-hmm. And I said, may I come in and share some time with you? And they are looking for presence and light. They remember a time when there was a prosperity in their spirits. They remember the Creator. They remember that there was a presence of God in their lives, and we're just returning that to them.
That's good. Let's unpack that a little bit, because you guys have produced a couple of videos that I've seen over the last few years that I don't know if you've received any pushback on it because, as a missiologist, I think it's awesome. But I could imagine, somebody seeing you doing these projects where you're going back into the indigenous peoples and you're helping them with their totem poles, or you're helping them with their rediscovery of their own heritage and culture. Because, as I understand, some of the unfortunate consequences of Christian mission in Alaska, a lot of the Christian missionaries forced the native peoples to give up their culture because
Right.
the Christians didn't necessarily understand it. Can you unpack that some for me?
Yeah, that actually was the door in. We were just asking God to show us where to go and to open doors. And we were in a village that was about maybe 60 people, and we were offering to help. And they found out that we were missionaries, and there was tremendous suspicion because of what you just mentioned. That their muscle memory of missionaries is not good.
Mm-hmm.
Missionaries colluded with the government to extract children from families and to put them in boarding schools, to change the way they dress, the food they eat, to take away their blankets, and to burn their totem poles. The totem poles themselves are such an example of an expression of the core identity of these people. And I'm specifically speaking of the Southeast Alaska Indian tribes, the ones Teresa mentioned, the Tlingit, the Haida, and the Tsimshian tribes. I know that there are places in the world where carvings do have an occult connection. Mm-hmm. So we understand that. That is not the case for Alaska Natives. Here, the totem pole represents a sort of family scrapbook. Mm-hmm. In the same way that you or I might put pictures of our ancestors, and then sit down with our children and go through a picture of a great great grandfather might come up, and what I've noticed is that in typical American culture, when we get past the great great, we often don't really know much about that person at all. Mm-hmm. But if we do, we tell the stories about that person. We tell about the heritage, about the kind of person that they were, the kind of character they had, and the things they did to make this world better. We tell our kids those stories because we want to remind them where they came from, that the soil from which they have sprung is rich, and it's worth living up to. There's something really important about that. Now, what I'm obviously describing is this rich native culture that we have here in Alaska. The totem poles provide an opportunity. Each one of them tell a story. Mm-hmm. So there's family poles, there's clan poles, there's tribal poles, and so the various levels of the stories being told. When the young ones are brought to the pole, there's an elder that tells the story. So they're an oral culture, and they pass things on orally. And there are mortuary poles. Mm-hmm. So if you ever hear something that they're somehow connected to the dead, well, they are in the same way that you and I would have a headstone that would commemorate a family member in a graveyard. Mortuary pole is exactly the same thing.
So when we go to the graveyard and we look at the tombstone, we're not worshiping the tombstone.
No, and we're not worshiping the dead either.
No.
What we're doing is acknowledging that especially those of us who call ourselves believers, that the heritage we have of God reaching us, it comes to us generationally. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can tell you of my great great grandmother, and how she was the one that held the line on making sure that her children made it to church and would not budge on that one. And I honestly believe that faith came to me because of that. And so for us, we were in this village, and they told us a story. There was an 80-year-old woman who told us, no, she was a 90-year-old woman, but she told us about 80 years before how the local church had struggled with a conflict that had happened. And that is that there was a carving shed where the men and the young men would gather over the weekends And there would be a conflict between that gathering and the church gathering. And so the pastor then began to preach against that as some sort of work of the devil, and incited other natives within that village to go burn the carving shed down as a way of removing some sort of obstacle to the gospel. And that was a part of the entire larger process of seeing their children removed to boarding schools and all of those things happening. So when Teresa and I came back, we knew historically, from a cultural standpoint, we had nothing to bridge. We knew that and valued that. We grew up with Native kids. They, to these days, are our friends, our dear friends. We cry together. We go to each other's weddings, funerals. We weep, we laugh, and so we knew that. But I remember at that meeting, all I asked that 80-year-old woman or that 90-year-old woman was if it were possible, if they were willing, could they allow the church to be a part of replacing something that the church took away? And of course, they were concerned about all the attached strings, and we just told them that you can pull the plug on this anytime. And so they had logs, we had a sawmill, and the ability to bring in construction teams and expertise. And they had some labor that we ended up training, and we built a carving shed. And there were no strings. It was an act of pure love because we saw that God was stirring in them the restoration of this cultural side of things. And so that was a 20-foot by 60-foot building. So that led to another village who called us and asked us if we might help them. And that led to a 30-foot by a 60-foot building. And then a third village called us, and that led to a 42-foot by 60-foot building. So wow. they wanted, each one of them wanted to step it up. And so today, and I'll finish this out with this, is that we are in a village called Heidelberg. We've spent 5 years building relationships and keeping promises, avoiding pitfalls. Like for instance, one of the things that they offered us was land so that we could build a church, and we turned them down. We felt like the Lord said, don't do that. And the reason is because in their minds, we knew that they expected us to build a church and to put a white pastor in there. And we knew that they would relate to it as one of those kinds of churches. But we have a very high value as missionaries to indigenize the church. And so we asked them the question, what would it look like? What would a church look like if it was pastored by one of you, pastored by a native leader? And anyway, and that was a question they hadn't wrestled with before. And part of what we were in the middle of was having the conversation that would lead to the structure that we're building there now, and that's a clan house. Within that village of Heidelberg, there's multiple clans. The struggle was, which clan do we build a house for first? And how do they resolve the potential conflict that might arise between, who comes first, who comes second? Anyway, I remember the conversation where God revealed to them that they could actually depart from some of those historical approaches to that. And now what we are building for them is a larger community clan house that they all call home. And I remember turning to Joel Buchanan and to Teresa in that conversation, and Joel Buchanan is our Tlingit leader out on the island. And I said, you know what they just decided to do? They just decided to build their own church.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
So for us, the aspect of coming in, we had to rinse our thinking of a lot of the Western ways, like Teresa mentioned, that we might do church planting, so that we really arrive at something that is birthed uniquely from them. And it requires great restraint, which I think is a much neglected form of leadership.
Yeah, that it is. What have been some, or let me say it like this, are there some books that you would recommend to any of our listeners that would help them begin to understand this difference of how you're talking about seeing the culture as God has already been there working to bring the people to a relationship with himself, and how you can come in as a missionary and help them understand Jesus Christ as Son of God, Son of Man, the fulfillment of all longing, that help them get this clarity. I know for myself, the book Eternity in Their Hearts by Don Richardson was just phenomenal, and I would highly recommend it. How about for you and Teresa or Rod? Any recommendations?
Oh, absolutely. Rod is just gathering a couple of them right now that he had pulled out for this very part of the conversation.
Oh, great.
I'll say for myself, something that changed my heart and how I would move within and among the people that I was being sent home to. And I started training to do the work that I'm doing now before I even knew I was going to get to come home. And it is not necessarily, it's not a how do we do church, but it is to me. And the book is called Here If You Need Me, by a woman. She wrote it. Her husband was a Maine state warden who was like our Alaska state troopers. And she actually inspired me, or that message that was in that book, Here If You Need Me, and she inspired me to move towards law enforcement and the things that they see, and how to serve them in a highly underserved area in our state, because we are all rough and wild, and I finally make sense here, by the way. For all those times, I know how to dress up and be really, well, not really, maybe, but be efficiently effective from a platform. But I make sense here with a gun in my hand, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally makes sense.
And then a Bible in my hand. But the book is called Here If You Need Me, and it's a true story by Kate Braestrup. She is a remarkable chaplain to law enforcement, and what she did is she just talked about being not a constant, but a requested presence. We show up when we're asked to, and I just want to, just before Rod starts on his list, explain why this means so much to me. Because after 5 years of being in our law enforcement community and first responders here, there are people now who see the worst of the worst. I mean, yesterday, one of our officers brought his wife and his children over, and we shared a meal. And we're going to be spending more time with them this week as they go through some difficult circumstances. Something that happened Saturday is one of our 20-year dispatchers made a decision that she was going to give a gift towards the mobile kitchen that we will use to serve the underserved, not just the poor, but the underserved in our community and in our state, where we can provide food to them, because she sees the value in that. She's the way she described it is, she said, Teresa, we know when you're in this building, we know when you're on a call, we know when you're in a neighborhood, because there is a light that follows you. There's a light that's in you. This text that I got last night from this person says, we know when you're here and when you're not. You bring us light, you bring us hope, and you never use those specific words. But I believe at 5 years, there's a point now where I can begin to speak to those other areas where Jesus is God and man and Savior to the world. And it has taken us that long, and that is not the way you usually plant a church.
Good stuff.
Jeff, you asked about books. There's 3 that I have found incredibly helpful. One is real specific to Alaska, and anyway, it's called Another Culture, Another World. And it's written by Father Michael Oleksa. And anyway, he is the general overseer for the Russian Orthodox Church here in Alaska. And anyway, with him, it's all about exploring the great diversity, but common humanity that we and I think that is something that is sometimes missed, is that we can look for the differences and try to figure out how to bridge. But I'll tell you, the connect points of all the areas we have in common as human beings is what will quickly bring people together. A couple of other books would be Ministering Cross-Culturally, and that's by Sherwood Lingenfelter.
Oh, yeah, great book.
Yeah, I really I love the incarnational approach that he has, and the willingness to go and become a part of a people.
Okay.
And that, to me, it's one thing to live in Anchorage, but it's another thing to shed all of that when I step into somebody else's world.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, so, you find yourself in the strangest of places. But that had to have been a little bit like what it was for Jesus to come.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And then the last one that I really have enjoyed is Cross-Cultural Conflict by Duane Elmer.
Okay, yeah.
And I think that conflict is sometimes the greatest place of opportunity, where there is a mistake made,
Mm-hmm.
where to some dimension, in the process of trying to bridge cross culturally, there is some faux pas, something that we do, something dumb. One of the things I try to let people know from the very get-go, we're going to make mistakes, and we're going to offend, even you in this relationship possibly, but we make this pledge to you that we will do everything we can to make it right.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, understanding the culture and understanding when conflict has happened and moving in a Christ-like way to be able to make things right, whatever that takes, however much it costs, that is as much a part of seeing doors open and the walls and relationships fall as anything we've seen.
That is wonderful. Now, if somebody wanted to get involved with you guys, what you're doing up in Alaska, do you guys have openings for team members or people coming on short-term teams? You'd mentioned a little bit of that earlier. Do you still have opportunities like that?
Yeah, we do. We have teams that we host every year. And, contacting us through northofhope.com.
Okay.
There is a team inquiry page there where anybody can send a message, and we're very quick to respond. And so individuals can be placed within existing teams, and typically what we do is have a conversation to kind of find out what might be a good match and then suggest some options.
Okay, great. And we'll include links to your website plus these books. We'll include links in the show notes for everybody.
Okay, great. Yeah. And so that's a great way to be able to contact us.
Okay.
And I just wanted to add one more book that I picked up that I'm reading right now that is really well written, I think, is Hugh Halter. We're familiar with him. It's called Brimstone, The Art and Act of Holy Nonjudgment.
Oh, that sounds good. And what's his name? Hugh
Halter, Halter. He has recently left the Denver area to go and live right near Ferguson, Missouri, simply because at some point, he makes this point, at some point you have to actually leave all the found ones. Of course, we tend to find people who feel the way we do. And,
yes,
and
of course.
Went, oh, yes. He says at some point you have to leave all the words and not necessarily all the comfort because his family is around him, but start again with those who have no people, no tribe. So the art and act of holy non-judgment. It's one thing to sit around and talk about what would you do, and it's another thing to say this is who I am and this is how I will do.
Great. We'll include that in the show notes as well. Hey, guys, one more question. I ask this of every guest on the podcast. If we had a time machine and we could go back in time to your 25-year-old self, what advice would you give yourself now?
Oh, goodness. Don't worry. I would have to say don't worry about stuff. Well, there's such joy in getting older. You may or may not know this. There's a lot of joy in getting older and facing so many things. Resiliency is being built all the time. Mm. And that is something I just did not understand. At some of my greatest points of what I thought were failures and weaknesses, God was building resilience in me. And so I pray that even there's from Psalm 139, if I go up to heaven, you are there. How can I flee from your spirit? How can I avoid your presence? If I go into heaven, you are there. If I go and make my bed in hell, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the morning and camp by the farthest oceans, even there, Your hand will guide me, and your strength will support me. And so I have learned in the even theirs that I am supported, I am strengthened, and even when it seems so dark, that there are treasures in darkness. And so, Teresa, don't worry. Especially in this last 18 months, we're having 2 cancer diagnoses and coming through, and hideous procedures and things I never thought I would face. We would face together. That at one point, the Lord just came very close, whispered, I still don't know if it was audible or not, but just came very close and just said, you didn't know how many days you had before. You don't know how many days you have now. Yeah. It just seems a little closer. That's all. He says, but I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I will never cause you to walk through deep waters alone. And so I would say to my 25-year-old self, Teresa, don't worry.
Good advice. What about you, Rod?
Well, I would take my 25-year-old self out behind the woodshed. And I would say, listen, there are 3 things that you need to incorporate into how you respond to people, how you work with people. And those 3 things would be basically this: say these things a lot. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Number 2. And lastly, a whole lot of this is, I don't know.
Takes a lifetime to learn those lessons, doesn't it?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm a lot. I know a lot less today than I knew at age 25. I guarantee you. I'm struck with that all the time, and if I want a life with people that is full and worth living, then I need to be quick to say I'm sorry and to ask forgiveness.
Yeah.
Saying I don't know is just an acknowledgement that there is so much out there that it falls outside of my ability to grasp.
Yeah. Well, guys, it has been a real joy to be able to talk with you, reconnect. It's been a little while since we've had a chance to talk, and we'll include links for you guys on the show notes. If people want to get in touch with you, if they want to support, with prayer, financial support, teams, anything, we'd love to have people connect with you guys. And I think if nothing else, just like what you and I talked one time when you guys were still down in Southern California, how you helped in my own family, helping us with some family that lived down there, mentoring them and coaching them, and you were a real impact in their lives. I know that people would be positively impacted by being touched by both of you guys. Just think the world of you. And so just thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. It's so good to see you again.
It's good talking with you guys.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us this week on All In. Be sure to reach out to Rod and Teresa. You'll be glad that you did. God bless you guys.
Well, we're done now. Thanks for listening. This is Jeff Roper reminding you that the mission of God is too grand for mediocrity or average living. You were created for a purpose, and that purpose is found in the mission of God. It's your life. Now go live it.